Artemisia cold-bloodedly sank an Allied ship, killing all witnesses to deceive two kings and turn a shameful retreat into a triumph. For her, the sea was no place for heroism. It was a chessboard where, sometimes, you must sacrifice a piece of your own color to save the queen. She became the first woman to hold the rank of Admiral not through a king's favor, but through an icy understanding that morality is ballast that drags a ship to the bottom. In a world collapsing before her eyes in the straits of Salamis, Artemisia chose the only logical path, a path of absolute, mathematically precise pragmatism, where the price of survival was measured in the lives of those who called her a friend. The September sun of 480, before Common Era stood at its zenith, but its light barely pierced through the acrid, resinous smoke choking the strait. The air was so thick with soot, salt, and the stench of sweat from thousands of rowers that it felt as though it could be cut with a blade. The massive Persian fleet, intended to crush the Greeks, was suffocating in the congestion, and the deck beneath Artemisia's feet vibrated from the dull, visceral thuds of neighboring ships colliding in the narrow passage. She stood at the stern, and her hands, gripping the carved railing, did not tremble, though her knuckles were white with tension. Xerxes' plan was crumbling. The pride of the empire was turning into a heap of wreckage. Right behind her, cutting through the foamy waves with predatory grace, came an Athenian hunter. Captain Palin knew exactly whose vessel he was pursuing. The reward of 10,000 drachmas for the head of the Queen of Halicarnassus was the most coveted prize of this war. Artemisia heard the rhythmic, furious shouts of the Greek rowers, echoing through the roar of battle. They were close, too close. To the right loomed ruthless cliffs. To the left, Phoenician triremes blazed, and the only path to retreat was blocked by the hull of an ally, the ship of King Damasithemus. The choice: slow down and fight, die with honor, leave her kingdom and her son to be torn apart, or commit the unthinkable. Her gaze flicked back. The Athenian hunter, closer and closer. Ahead, the lumbering side of Damasithemus, a trap, back, forth, threat, obstacle. The equation resolved itself not in her head, but in her gut, cold, simple. The obstacle must become the salvation. Artemisia involuntarily straightened her back and placed her hand on the hilt of her sword, preparing not to defend herself, but to strike a blow that would shatter the very idea of loyalty. Her voice cut through the chaos, dry and firm. Full speed ahead. Target Damasithemus. The deck beneath her feet bucked so violently that men were thrown to the planks. A deafening crack tore through the air. The cedar hull of the Calindian ship exploded in a cloud of sharp, razor-like splinters. The bronze ram of Artemisia's trireme pierced her ally's side almost soundlessly, softly, with a terrifying ease, like a knife through butter. And the fraction of a second of silence that followed, as the two ships fused in a deadly embrace, was more terrifying than any scream. Artemisia saw a fragment of the stern ornament break off from the horrific impact, a unique carved griffin, the personal crest of Damasithemus. The gilded figure, bobbing upon the blood-stained waves, drifted slowly away, carrying the secret of this maneuver with it. The Calindian ship began to sink rapidly, choking on the salt foam. Artemisia gave the order to back water, freeing the bronze from the mangled hull. The water around them instantly boiled with hundreds of men. Soldiers, encased in heavy bronze, sank like stones before they could even grasp who had struck them. The few who had managed to shed their cuirasses clung desperately to the oars of her trireme, begging for mercy. But Artemisia knew. One surviving witness reaching the shore would become her executioner. "Throw them off! Clear the oars!" Her command was met with a split second of hesitation, but the steel in her eyes left no room for choice. She watched personally as her warriors struck the hands of the drowning men with heavy spears, forcing them to release their grip. She looked directly into the eyes of Damosithimus as the abyss swallowed him. And in her gaze, there was neither rage nor pity, only the icy calm of a chess player removing a redundant piece. Captain Palin, watching this scene from the deck of the Hunter, suddenly ordered his rowers to lift their oars. Amidst the chaos of battle, he had witnessed the impossible. The Persian queen had cold-bloodedly destroyed one of her own. "She is for us," the Athenian decided. Convinced he was looking at a secret Greek ally or a defector, Palin turned his ship, abandoning the pursuit. The spiral of betrayal tightened. The price of survival was 300 lives of her own people, but for Artemisia, it was a justified fee for the right to breathe. On Mount Egaleo, seated upon a massive golden throne beneath the shade of purple silk canopies, Xerxes I watched the maneuver. Here, at an unreachable height, the air was still and heavy with the scent of incense, myrrh, and roasted meat. A feast that continued even as the empire perished below. This exquisite comfort contrasted sharply, almost painfully, with the acrid smoke and the stench of rotting sea silt rising from the strait. The distance and the thick veil of smoke from hundreds of blazing triremes had turned a bloody slaughter into a flawless heroic epic. The king saw only a swift, predatory strike, and how the vessel under Artemisia's familiar banners sent an enemy to the bottom. In the chaos of battle, where the Persian fleet was being pushed haphazardly against the jagged rocks, this act of fierce attack became for Xerxes the only straw he could grasp to save his pride. "Look," he cried to his satraps, springing from his throne so suddenly that the golden ornaments on his robes gave a dry, anxious chime. "Today, my men have become women, and my women have become men." He was not just watching, he was intoxicated by the illusion, unaware that at this very moment he was applauding the execution of his own loyal vassal. When the battle finally dissolved into a bloody chaos and Artemisia brought her damaged ship to the shallows at the very foot of the mountain, every sound felt like a threat. The crunch of pebbles beneath the keel, the hiss of foam, the cries of seagulls, it all merged into one haunting background. She stepped onto the shore, where the sand was mixed with wreckage, scraps of rigging, and bodies washed up on land which the sea had already begun to turn into refuse. The king's retinue was already hurrying toward her, their polished armor gleaming. Artemisia instinctively straightened her back, her hand falling to the hilt of her sword. She felt the cold bronze against her skin, preparing not to defend herself, but to sell her life dearly. Yet, instead of guards, she was met with low, sycophantic bows. Xerxes' observers, armed with sophisticated Egyptian optics for scanning the horizon, surrounded her, vying with one another to report her incredible valor to the king. These men, trembling for their own heads, helped her lie take root. In the heat of battle, through the haze of fires, they had failed to recognize the Calindian ship, but they had clearly seen the bright markings on the prow of Artemisia's vessel. It was in their interest to report a victory to the king, not a betrayal. They convinced Xerxes that she had destroyed one of the most dangerous Athenian strategists. It was an incredible, almost mystical convergence of circumstances. The enemy had abandoned the pursuit, taking her for an ally, and her own master had elevated her to the rank of a war goddess, because his own eyes and the lies of his servants had crafted a convenient truth for him. However, Artemisia saw what they did not. While Xerxes showered her with praise, a coastal wave began to lazily, almost mockingly, wash the wreckage of the ship she had sunk toward the king's feet. She froze, staring at the wet sand. There it was, that very carved griffin. The gilding on the fragment of Damosithymus' stern ornament shone dully beneath the rays of the setting sun. This piece of wood was undeniable proof of her guilt, lying just a few steps from the golden sandals of the Lord of Asia. It would have taken only one surviving Calindian to choke on a scream upon this shore, or one observant courtier to pick up this fragment, and her entire strategy for survival would have turned into an ignominious execution. Artemisia stood motionless, her gaze fixed on the griffin as it slowly crawled along the sand, following the retreating water. But the sea at her back proved to be the most reliable accomplice. It was merciless and silent. The heavy armor of the Calindians and the vast depth of the strait had finished the work she had begun with her bronze ram. Not one living soul emerged from that bloody foam to point a finger at her. She stood in the very heart of the royal camp, receiving the empire's highest honors, while behind her, the salt water finished the cleanup of witnesses, forever hiding a monstrous act of betrayal beneath the silt and turning it into a pure legend, untainted by the truth. Inside the massive royal tent pitched atop the hill, time seemed to stand still. Here, amidst heavy embroidered curtains, the scent of cedar oil and expensive incense fought the acrid, undeniable aroma of smoke that had thoroughly permeated Artemisia, hair and clothing. While the great empire suffocated in shame outside the silk walls, Artemisia realized the ultimate truth. Truth is not a granite cliff, but pliable wax in the hands of the one who remains standing last. Looking into Xerxes' eyes, clouded by shock and rage, she understood. The King of Kings did not need to know how his fleet had turned into splinters. He needed an excuse. He needed a story that would allow him to leave without losing face before the gods and his subjects. She became that excuse. She became the only version of reality he desperately wanted to believe. The atmosphere in the tent was electric. Distinguished male commanders, whose names thundered from India to Egypt, now stood with their eyes cast down, afraid even to breathe under the heavy gaze of their sovereign. They smelled of fear and defeat. Artemisia stood straight, and her fingers, still stained with salt scales and soot, confidently took a cup of wine from the hands of the slaves. When Xerxes ordered her to be clad in golden armor and presented her with precious cups, a dead silence hung in the tent. This was not just a reward, it was a ritual gesture, the payment for the illusion of triumph. While other generals mentally said goodbye to their lives, Artemisia, the first and only woman among them, attained the status of a supreme judge. She saw in Xerxes not a deity, but a broken man who was so afraid of shame that he was ready to elevate anyone who called his catastrophe a tactical maneuver. It was then that she made her final, most precise move. Placing her hand on the hilt of the gifted sword, she gave the king advice that changed the course of history forever. Leave this cursed Greece, great king. You have burned Athens. You have already won. Leave Mardonius here with a portion of the troops. If he wins, the glory will be yours. Will be. If he falls, you lose nothing, for only your slave will perish, while you yourself will return home in a halo of glory. Every word she spoke fell in the silence of the tent, like a heavy golden coin. She was not just saving her life, she was giving the king a path to retreat, paved with his own pride. Xerxes, blinded by her feigned loyalty, listened to her as if she were an oracle. He gave the order to withdraw, ensuring Artemisia not only safety, but the right to leave Salamis as one of the first. She preserved her ships and her small kingdom at the cost of an absolute, mathematically calculated betrayal. All the plot lines finally closed that evening as her triremes slowly cut through the black water, leaving the bay. Damasithemus was officially declared a hero who fell to an enemy ram. His name entered into the scrolls of honor, and Artemisia sat at the stern, watching the shorelights of Persia turn into tiny dots. She realized the main truth of that day. In a world where everything is built on lies for the sake of power, the one whose lie proves to be the most majestic and merciless wins. Looking at the dark, indifferent water of Salamis, the first woman admiral knew. The sea kept her secret safely beneath the layers of silt. She turned a shameful retreat into a triumph because she knew, in the great fire of history, it is not the most honest who survives, but the one who knows how to silence the truth in time. The last image her memory captured was the quiet, deep waves that forever hid both the carved griffin and the cries of the people she had betrayed, leaving the world only the legend she allowed to be written.